On the morning of the 27th of January 1945, the cold bit with a cruelty that seemed to compete with that of men. Snow covered Poland's roads like a white shroud, and the winter silence was broken only by the crunch of boots on ice and the dull throb of engines. The Red Army advanced from the east, pushing what remained of the Wehrmacht toward the west, closing a circle that had begun years earlier at Stalingrad. The Soviet soldiers of the 60th Army of the First Ukrainian Front did not know exactly what they would find in the complex that appeared on maps under a Polish name, Auschwitz I. To them it was another point on the route, another occupied town to liberate, another knot in the railway network that connected east to west. They did not expect testimonies. They did not expect proof. They did not expect that place to mark them forever. Days earlier, Soviet intelligence had received vague reports about German installations in the area. Factories, perhaps. Forced labor camps, probably. The war was full of such places. Barracks, barbed wire, starving prisoners. All of Poland was a landscape of accumulated destruction. But something in the reconnaissance reports stood out. Constant smoke in recent days, burned structures, disorderly movement of retreating German troops, and a strange silence in the surroundings. Nearby villages seemed empty or closed in on themselves. No one spoke much. No one asked. The order was simple. Advance. Secure the territory. Continue the pursuit. The 100th Rifle Division, under the command of Major Anatoly Shapiro, received the task of inspecting the complex. There were no dramatic expectations. The war had taught soldiers to expect destruction, but also not to be too surprised. They had seen razed cities, burned villages, mass graves in open fields. The Eastern Front had been a school of brutality, where every kilometer taken revealed something worse than the last. The first patrols approached from the south, following the railway line. The ground bore the marks of recent abandonment. Tracks that disappeared into dirty snow. Low buildings with broken windows. Watchtowers still holding dark, unlit searchlights. There was no resistance. No gunshots. No movement in the sentry boxes. The place looked dead, but not empty. There was something in the air, a smell the soldiers could not identify at first. It was not the smell of gunpowder they knew. It was not the smell of burned wood from bombed cities. It was something denser, more organic, something that clung to the throat and made it hard to breathe without feeling nausea. When they crossed the first barbed wire fences, the soldiers saw the extent of the complex. Kilometers of double fencing with barbed wire, towers every 100 meters, barracks lined up in endless rows, gravel paths stretching in straight lines, everything designed with a precision that seemed military, but with a purpose that had not yet revealed itself. The structures did not look like ordinary quarters. They were too uniform, too dense, too enclosed. And the silence was unnatural. In a labor camp there should have been noise. Voices, movement, some activity. Here there was only stillness. Major Shapiro ordered them to advance with caution. Experience told him the Germans might have left traps, mines, straggling snipers, but there were no explosions, there were no shots. Only that smell, growing stronger with every step. When they reached the main entrance to one sector of the complex, they saw the iron arch with black letters, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. The soldiers did not understand German, but the structure of the message, a slogan on an entrance arch, felt familiar. They had seen similar things in other camps. What they still did not understand was the brutal irony of those words in that specific place. They passed under the arch. On the other side, the landscape changed subtly but definitively. The barracks were closer to one another. The windows were narrow, almost slits. The doors looked reinforced from the outside. And then the first figures appeared. At first, the soldiers thought they were shadows or heaps of abandoned clothing, but the shadows moved, slowly, clumsily, as if movement cost them an enormous effort. They were people, or what was left of people. A Soviet soldier, whose name was later recorded in testimonies as Grigory, described that moment with words that tried to capture the impossible. He said the figures looked like dressed skeletons, that their eyes were too large for their faces, that their hands looked like bone claws covered by skin so thin the blue veins showed through. that some tried to walk and stopped every 2 steps, leaning on walls or the ground, that others were sitting or lying in the snow, motionless, and it was hard to tell whether they were alive or dead. The soldiers stopped, not by order, but from shock. They had seen hunger before. They had seen malnourished German prisoners of war. They had seen civilians in occupied territories living at the edge. But this was something else. It was a level of physical destruction that looked designed. It was not the result of the chaos of war. It was the result of a method. The people who approached or tried to approach did not walk like ordinary starving people. They crawled, they trembled, some cried without sound. Others extended their hands as if begging for help, but without the strength to speak. A Soviet officer ordered the field medics to come forward. But the medics stopped too, overwhelmed. They did not know where to begin. There were too many, and the condition of the bodies was so extreme that it was not clear how many could be saved. The wounds were not recent. They were old wounds that had not closed. Infections that had been there for weeks. Edema that indicated prolonged malnutrition. Some prisoners had frozen feet, black and numb. Others coughed with a wet sound that indicated advanced tuberculosis. And all of them, without exception, had that look, a mix of terror, disbelief, and something the soldiers would not recognize until later. It was the look of someone who no longer expects anything. The prisoners who could still speak began to approach the soldiers, not to ask for food, though the hunger was obvious, but to confirm something that seemed impossible, that the soldiers were real, that they were not guards, that they were not yet another trap. Some touched the Soviet uniforms with trembling fingers, as if they needed to verify the texture of the cloth. Others repeated words in languages the soldiers did not understand: Polish, Yiddish, Hungarian, French, Czech. A babble of desperation with a single message. Is it true? Is it over? The soldiers did not know what to answer, because they themselves still did not understand what it was that had ended. Major Shapiro ordered a perimeter established and urgent messages sent to higher command. But he also ordered something else: that no one touch anything without recording it, that they take notes, that they photograph. Because, even if they did not fully understand what they were seeing, they knew it was important. They knew it was not an ordinary prisoner of war camp. They knew it was evidence of something larger. Meanwhile, other groups of soldiers began to explore the complex. One platoon entered the barracks. Inside, the darkness was almost total. The windows were covered or broken. The floor was dirt or rotten wood. And inside there were bunks. But not like those in a barracks. They were 3-tier wooden structures, so narrow that a single person barely fit in each space. And yet there were 2, 3, 4 bodies pressed together on each plank. Some were alive, others were not. And in many cases, it was difficult to tell. A soldier turned on a flashlight, and the beam revealed a scene that looked like it had come out of a nightmare. Bodies piled in impossible positions, tattered blankets that covered nothing, overturned metal containers with remnants of something that might have been soup days earlier. And on the walls, marks, scratches, names written in charcoal or with fingernails, dates, messages in languages the soldier did not understand, but whose desperation was universal. The smell inside the barracks was unbearable, a mix of feces, urine, sweat, infection, death. The soldiers stumbled out coughing, eyes watering. Outside, they tried to explain to the officer what they had seen, but words were not enough. The officer went in himself, and when he came out, his face had changed. It was no longer the face of a soldier carrying out orders. It was the face of a man who had just understood that the war had a level he had never imagined. Other soldiers moved toward larger structures. There were brick buildings, more solid than the wooden barracks. Some had tall chimneys. Others had reinforced metal doors. In one of those buildings, a group of soldiers found ovens. Not bakery ovens, industrial ovens, with iron doors and rails for inserting loads. Inside some of them there were still remains, ash, fragments of bone, a burnt smell unlike anything they had ever smelled before. One of the soldiers, an engineer by training, examined the ovens with a mix of technical curiosity and growing horror. They were ovens designed to burn at very high temperatures, ovens built to process volume, ovens that made no sense in an ordinary prison camp, unless the purpose of the camp was not to hold prisoners, but to eliminate them. The engineer tried to calculate capacity. He tried to estimate how many bodies could be burned in a day. The number he obtained forced him to leave the building to vomit into the snow. Near the ovens, there was another structure, a door sealed with bolts. A soldier opened it and found a room with showers in the ceiling. But the showers were connected to pipes that carried no water. And on the floor, there were scratch marks, deep, desperate, as if someone had tried to dig into the cement with their nails. The walls had dark stains, and the air, though cold, retained a chemical residue that irritated the eyes. The soldier ran out. He could not breathe. He could not process what he had seen. But his mind was already making connections. A sealed room, fake showers, pipes with no water, scratches on the floor, stains on the walls, ovens a few meters away. And outside, thousands of people reduced to skeletons. The equation was monstrous, but simple. This was not a labor camp. It was an extermination camp. Meanwhile, in other sectors of the complex, Soviet soldiers found more evidence. Warehouses full of personal belongings. An entire building filled with shoes. Mountains of shoes. Children's, adults, the elderly's. Thousands upon thousands, piled without order. Another building with clothing. Coats, dresses, trousers, underwear. Everything mixed together. Everything filthy, soaked with the smell of death. And in another building, more disturbing still, suitcases. Hundreds of suitcases with names written on them, mostly Jewish surnames, addresses from cities the soldiers recognized: Warsaw, Budapest, Berlin, Prague. Each suitcase was a family. Each name was a person who had arrived there, believing they were going to a resettlement. A soldier opened a suitcase and found photographs. A family, smiling. Children in a park. A wedding. The photos were intact, as if someone had kept them carefully, as if they would need them later. But that later never came. The soldier closed the suitcase and felt something he had not felt throughout the war. A cold, deep rage with no outlet. In another, more distant sector, the soldiers found half-destroyed structures. The Germans had tried to blow them up before retreating. Brick buildings with collapsed walls, fallen roofs, rubble mixed with snow. But even in the ruins, the evidence was clear. There were rails leading inward. There were raised platforms. There were airtight doors. There were windows barred from the outside. And in the surroundings, the ground had a dark color, as if it had been soaked with something that was not water. The soldiers began to understand the scale. This was not a building. It was a complex of buildings. A factory of death, designed, built, and operated with the efficiency of a production line. And what it produced was absence. It produced emptiness. It produced ash. As the soldiers processed the horror, the prisoners kept appearing. They came out of the barracks. They came out of hiding places. They came out of corners where they had waited for death for days. Some could walk. Others crawled. Some cried. Others laughed with a joyless laugh. Pure hysteria. And some simply looked at the soldiers with an expression that would haunt them for years. A mix of gratitude and reproach. Gratitude for arriving. Reproach for taking so long. Soviet medics began to work. They set up first aid posts in the least damaged buildings. They distributed blankets, hot water, a little food. But they had to be extremely careful. Malnourished bodies could not process normal food. A piece of bread could kill someone whose digestive system had been empty for weeks. There were prisoners who ate too quickly and died that same day. A final cruelty after surviving hunger. Soviet officers began organizing a registry. They wanted names, nationalities, stories. But most prisoners could not speak much. They were too weak, too traumatized, or simply did not trust anyone. They had learned that speaking could be dangerous, that giving information could be used against them. Many answered in monosyllables. Others pointed to their arms, where numbers were tattooed. The soldiers did not understand what they meant, but they soon would. One of the officers, a captain named Vasily Gromov, tried to speak with a prisoner who seemed to have more energy than the others. The prisoner spoke some Russian, mixed with Polish. He explained that he had been one of the privileged. He had worked in the warehouses, he had sorted clothing, he had survived because he had a function. But most of those who arrived did not have that luck. Most died the same day. Gromov asked how. The prisoner pointed at the chimneys. "There," he said. And he said nothing more. Gromov could not believe it. He asked how many. The prisoner shrugged. "Thousands a day," he said. "For months. For years." Gromov made quick calculations. Thousands a day, multiplied by months, multiplied by years. The number was so large it seemed impossible. But the evidence was there. The shoes, the clothing, the ash, the ovens, the testimonies. Everything pointed to the same thing. That night, Major Shapiro sent an urgent report to higher command. He described what they had found. He asked for medical reinforcements. He asked for specialists. He asked that they send someone who could document it officially, because he knew that, when it became public, many would not believe it. He himself was still processing it, and he had been there. The next day, more troops arrived, and with them, Soviet journalists, photographers, cameramen. The Red Army had learned the importance of documenting Nazi crimes. They had found mass graves in other places. They had found razed villages. But this was different. It was not spontaneous violence. It was organized violence. It was the industrialization of death. The photographers began to work. They photographed the barracks. They photographed the prisoners. They photographed the ovens. They photographed the warehouses of shoes and clothing. They photographed the suitcases with names. They photographed the train tracks that ended at a ramp where thousands had stepped down without knowing it was their last journey. The images were brutal. There was no way to soften them. They were what they were. Evidence of a crime on a scale humanity had never seen before. The cameramen filmed the survivors. Some agreed to speak. Others only stared into the camera with those sunken eyes that said more than any words. A woman, who had lost her entire family, spoke in Yiddish. A translator tried to follow her, but she spoke too fast, with too much urgency, as if she feared there would not be enough time to tell everything. She described the arrival, the separation, the lie of the showers, the smoke that came out of the chimneys day and night, the smell that never went away. And at the end, when she finished, she fell silent and stared into the void. Meanwhile, the soldiers kept exploring. They found documents, not many, because the Germans had burned most of them before fleeing. But some papers had survived. Transport lists, delivery records, inventories of confiscated goods. The language was bureaucratic, almost dull. But behind every line there was a person. Behind every number, a family. In one of the administrative buildings, a soldier found a registry book. It was partially burned, but still legible. It contained dates, names, numbers, and next to many names, a German abbreviation, SB. The soldier did not know what it meant. Later, a translator explained. Sonderbehandlung, special treatment, a Nazi euphemism for murder. The soldiers also found some German guards. Not many. Most had fled, but some had stayed hidden, hoping the Soviets would pass by. When they were discovered, some tried to resist and were executed on the spot. Others surrendered. They were arrested and taken to Soviet prisoner of war camps. Their fate was not kind. The soldiers who captured them knew what had been done there. And although there were orders to treat prisoners according to the conventions of war, those orders were only half obeyed. One of the captured guards tried to justify himself. He said he was only following orders, that he had no choice, that if he refused, they would have killed him. The Soviet officer interrogating him looked at him in silence for a long time. Then he asked, "How many did you kill by following orders?" The guard did not answer. He could not. The answer was a number he did not even know himself. In the days that followed, more prisoners were found in other sectors of the complex. Auschwitz was not a single camp. It was a system of camps. Auschwitz I, the main camp. Auschwitz to Birkenau, the center of extermination. Auschwitz III, Monowitz, linked to factories, and dozens of smaller subcamps. The Soviets liberated them one by one, and in each one, the same scene: skeletal bodies, filthy barracks, evidence of systematic violence. In Birkenau, the horror reached its peak. That was where the main gas chambers were. That was where the trains unloaded their human cargo. That was where the ramp divided families into two groups: those who went straight to death, and those who had a few more months of life as forced laborers. The soldiers walked along the ramp. It was only a concrete path, but thousands had walked there for the last time. The history of the place weighed in the air like a physical presence. One of the soldiers, a Siberian who had seen brutal fighting in Stalingrad, said something that was recorded in his comrade's memoirs. "I thought I'd seen the worst in Stalingrad, but there we fought soldiers. Here they killed children, they killed the elderly, they killed entire families, and they did it without fighting. They just put them in a room and suffocated them. What kind of men do that?" The question had no simple answer, and perhaps the most disturbing thing was precisely that. These were not imaginary creatures. They were people. People capable of turning murder into routine, normalizing it, administering it like a process. And that reality was more frightening than any words. The Soviet doctors did what they could, but many prisoners died in the days following liberation. Their bodies simply could not recover. They had spent too long at the limit. Freedom came too late. They died with their eyes open, looking at the soldiers who had saved them, as if they still could not believe it was real. Other prisoners began to recover slowly. They gained a kilo, 2 kilos. They could take a few steps without collapsing. They could speak without running out of breath. And with physical recovery came something else. They began to tell their stories, to remember names, to look for other survivors from their towns, their families. Some found brothers, cousins, friends. Those reunions were heartbreaking. 2 wasted bodies embracing, crying, unable to believe the other had survived. But most found no one. They asked about their wives, their children, their parents. And the answer, almost always, was the same. A gesture toward the chimneys, a silence, a look that said everything. They had arrived together on the train. They had been separated on the ramp. And after that, never again. Only smoke. Soviet officers organized search teams. They wanted to find documentation. They wanted to understand the full structure of the camp. They wanted to identify those responsible. They found partial lists of SS personnel. They found signed orders. They found building plans. And each document was another piece of the puzzle. A system designed with German precision for a purpose that defied comprehension. They also found experiments. In some barracks there were hospitals, but they were not hospitals to heal. They were laboratories to experiment. Cold resistance tests, injections of toxic substances, forced sterilizations, surgeries without anesthesia. The medical records were written with a scientific coldness that made them even more disturbing. Each victim was a subject, each torture a procedure, each death a result. One of the Soviet doctors, a man who had treated war wounds for years, found those records and had to sit down. He could not keep reading. His hands trembled. He had dedicated his life to healing, and there were men with medical training who had used that knowledge to torture and kill. In the weeks that followed, the Red Army turned Auschwitz into an operations center. They brought more doctors, more supplies, more personnel. They set up improvised hospitals. They organized the transport of survivors who could travel to cities with better medical facilities. But many survivors did not want to leave. Auschwitz had been their prison, but now it was also the only place where they could hope to find someone from their family. So they stayed, walking among the barracks, looking at lists of names, asking every new survivor who appeared. Soviet journalists published their reports. The photographs appeared in newspapers in Moscow, London, New York. The world began to see what had happened. But even with the images and the testimonies, many could not believe it. It seemed too vast, too organized, too brutal. Some thought it was propaganda, that the images were manipulated, that the testimonies were exaggerated. But the soldiers who had been there knew the truth. They had seen the ovens. They had smelled death. They had held children in their arms who weighed less than a rifle. They had walked through barracks where the living slept beside the dead. They had seen mountains of shoes, suitcases with names, photographs of families that no longer existed. There was no manipulation. There was no exaggeration. And even so, words and images were not enough to explain the magnitude. Years later, in an interview, one of those soldiers said something that summed up the experience of many. "I entered Auschwitz as a soldier. I left as another person, because I saw something that should not exist. I saw proof that humans can organize to destroy other humans with terrifying efficiency. And once you see that, you can't stop seeing it." On the 27th of January 1945, when Soviet soldiers crossed the gates of Auschwitz, they did not know they were entering a place that would become a symbol of the Holocaust. They did not know that name Auschwitz would resonate for generations. They only knew they had found something terrible, something that had to be stopped, something that had to be documented, something the world had to know. And in the days that followed, as they cared for the survivors, as they cataloged the evidence, as they buried those who had not managed to survive until liberation, the Soviet soldiers carried out a task that was not in their original orders, but became essential. They were witnesses. Witnesses to a crime designed to leave no witnesses. Witnesses to a machinery of death that had operated for years. When they finally left Auschwitz to continue the war toward Berlin, they left behind a place that would never be forgotten. A place that, over time, would become a museum, a memorial, a classroom, a place where millions would later come to see with their own eyes what happened, to walk along the ramp where families were separated, to enter the barracks where thousands slept packed together, to look at the ovens where bodies were reduced to ash. But before leaving, there was still work to be done. Soviet soldiers spent weeks in Auschwitz, organizing the chaos, saving what could be saved, documenting what could not be recovered. It was exhausting work, not only physical, but mental. Each day brought new findings. Each day confirmed that what had been seen on the first day was not everything. There was always something more. In the subcamps, they found more prisoners. Some had been hidden, too sick or too frightened to come out when the first soldiers arrived. Others had been in punishment barracks, isolated, forgotten even by the guards in the final flight. When they were finally found, some were already dead. Others were so close to the end that they died hours after rescue, as if they had held on just long enough to see their liberators. The medical officers established protocols. They could not give solid food immediately. Malnourished bodies had to be refed gradually. Light broths, tiny portions increased day by day. But some prisoners could not wait. They found food hidden by compassionate soldiers, ate it all at once, and died. Their digestive systems, atrophied by months or years of hunger, could not process it. It was a final cruelty, to die from eating after having survived starvation. The soldiers learned quickly. They began to watch so that prisoners did not eat too much. Some prisoners became angry. They did not understand why their liberators denied them food. But the doctors were firm. It was for their own good. It was the difference between living and dying. Over time, the prisoners began to recover. Not quickly, not completely, but enough to begin to look like people again. Meanwhile, the investigations continued. Soviet intelligence officers wanted to understand how the system had worked. They questioned prisoners who had worked in administrative posts. They questioned captured guards. They reviewed every document found. And little by little, they assembled the puzzle. They discovered that Auschwitz had not operated in absolute secrecy. Nearby towns knew something. The civilian workers who built the installations knew something. The train engineers knew something. The companies that supplied the gas knew something. The companies that bought victims' hair to make fabric knew something. The jewelers who received gold extracted from teeth knew something. It was a system that required complicity on multiple levels. It could not function with only a handful of executioners. It needed a network. This revelation unsettled Soviet officers as much as the camp itself, because it meant it was not only a few fanatics. It was a system in which thousands had participated, directly or indirectly, in murder. Some out of ideology, others out of obedience, others out of convenience, others simply because it was their job and that was how it was done. Interrogations of the guards revealed patterns. Many had started elsewhere. Some came from the euthanasia programs, where the Nazi regime had practiced systematic killing by murdering people with disabilities. Others came from other camps, other assignments. And when they arrived at Auschwitz, they received training. Not conventional military training, but training in how to administer death, how to maintain order on the ramp, how to direct people toward the chambers without causing panic, how to maximize efficiency. A captured guard, during an interrogation, described his first day at Auschwitz. He said they had shown him the entire process, from the train's arrival to cremation. They explained that his job was to maintain the flow, that there must be no delays, that everything had to move quickly, and that if he had moral doubts, it was better to keep them to himself, because there was no room for weakness there. The Soviet interrogator asked whether he had doubts. The guard stayed silent for a long time. Then he said that at first he did, but that over time he got used to it, that he stopped seeing the prisoners as people, that they became units to be processed, that if he thought of them as people, he could not do his job. So he stopped thinking. That answer confirmed what Soviet officers were beginning to understand. The Nazi system had not only built a physical machinery for extermination, it had built a psychological machinery that allowed ordinary people to participate in it, through euphemistic language, through emotional distance, through the fragmentation of responsibilities. Each person did a small part, and could tell himself he was only doing his function. In the barracks, survivors began to organize. They formed groups by nationality, by language, Poles with Poles, Hungarians with Hungarians, French with French. There was some comfort in sharing a language, in being able to communicate without barriers. But there were also tensions, because in the camp there had been a hierarchy. Some prisoners had held privileged positions, kitchen, warehouses, administration, that had given them access to more food, better conditions, a higher chance of survival. Now, after liberation, those differences sparked resentment. Some survivors accused others of collaborating, of helping the Nazis, of saving themselves at the expense of others. Accusations flew. Some were fair, others were not. But all of them reflected a painful truth. In Auschwitz, survival had demanded impossible decisions, and those decisions left wounds that were hard to close. Soviet officers tried to mediate, but it was complicated. How could one judge a prisoner who had worked in the Sonderkommando, the forced group that carried bodies to the ovens? Technically, he had participated in the process, but he had done so under direct threat. If he refused, they killed him and put someone else in his place. Was he guilty? Was he a victim? Could he be both? These questions had no simple answers. The Soviets decided that would come later, with tribunals and proceedings. For the moment, the priority was saving lives, and the lives they were trying to save were fragile. The overcrowding of the camp had created perfect conditions for epidemics, and now, even after liberation, those diseases continued to kill. A quarantine was established. Survivors with symptoms were isolated. Barracks were disinfected. Infected clothing was burned. Doctors worked against the clock, knowing that each day increased the risk of contagion. It was a race against death that continued even after the Nazis were gone. Meanwhile, in other sectors of the camp, soldiers continued exploring. In one warehouse, they found something that left them speechless: human hair. Tons of human hair, packed in sacks, ready to be shipped. The Nazis used it to make fabric, to stuff mattresses. It was another detail of the horror. Even after killing someone, they continued extracting value from the body. A soldier who entered that warehouse ran out and vomited. Others refused to go in. The officer in charge ordered it documented, photographed, and then that building closed. There was no need for more soldiers to see it. They already had enough nightmares. In the weeks that followed, outside visitors began to arrive. Journalists from other countries, diplomats, high-ranking officers, everyone wanted to see with their own eyes. And everyone left with the same expression of shock. Some cried openly, others fell silent, unable to process it. One visitor, an American correspondent, wrote that he had covered the war for years, had seen battles, bombings, destroyed cities, but nothing had prepared him for Auschwitz. The Soviets organized tours of the camp, not for entertainment, but as evidence. They wanted the world to know. They wanted there to be no doubt. They took visitors along the ramp. They showed them the gas chambers. They showed them the ovens. They showed them the warehouses. They showed them the survivors. And they summarized it in one phrase. This is what the Nazis did. Some visitors asked why. What did they gain from killing millions of people? Soviet officers did not have a complete answer. They knew about anti-Semitic ideology, racial theories. But even with that, the scale seemed irrational. It required resources, transport, personnel resources that could have been used in the war. And yet the Nazis had prioritized extermination even when they were losing on every front. The conclusion was inevitable. The destruction of European Jewry had not been a side effect. It had been a central objective. As important as winning battles, perhaps more, because they kept doing it even when it was obvious the war was lost. They kept sending trains to Auschwitz even when they needed those trains to move troops. They kept assigning personnel to the camps even when they needed soldiers at the front. As the weeks passed, some survivors became strong enough to move. The Soviets organized evacuations to hospitals in liberated cities, but many did not want to leave. Auschwitz was horrible, but it was what they knew. The outside world was uncertain. They did not know what they would find. They did not know if their homes were still standing. They did not know whether anyone in their families had survived elsewhere. Some decided to stay near the camp, waiting for lists of survivors from other camps, waiting for a familiar name, waiting for a sign that they were not completely alone. They lived in limbo. They were no longer prisoners, but they did not feel free either, because freedom requires having somewhere to go, and many had nowhere. Soviet officers tried to help. They contacted Jewish organizations. They contacted the Red Cross. They contacted governments in exile. They tried to build networks to reunite families, to find scattered survivors. But it was a slow process. Communications were disrupted by war. Records had been destroyed, and many people had died without leaving a trace. In the ongoing interrogations of the guards, more details emerged. One described how selection worked on the ramp. When a train arrived, an SS doctor decided who lived and who died. It was a decision made in seconds. A quick glance. Young and strong to one side, old, sick children to the other. Those in the first group had a few months of life as forced laborers. Those in the second died within hours. The guard described how, sometimes, families tried to stay together. A mother refused to separate from her children. He had orders to use force if necessary. Blows, dogs, whatever it took to keep the process moving. Because delays meant chaos, and chaos meant people began to understand. And if they understood, they could resist. The Soviet interrogator asked if he ever felt pity. The guard said that at first he did, but that he had been told to harden his heart, to think of it as slaughtering cattle. That, according to Nazi ideology, they were not people, they were subhumans, enemies of the Reich, and that eliminating them was a service. The interrogator wrote those phrases in his report, and he added a dry conclusion. The process of dehumanization had not only destroyed the victims, it had also warped the perpetrators, to the point of allowing them to do what they did without breaking. As the interrogations unfolded, Soviet photographers continued documenting. They had taken thousands of photographs, but they wanted more. Every angle, every detail. They knew it would be historic, that those images would be used in trials, that they would be seen for generations, and they carried the responsibility of documenting with precision. They photographed the bunks where prisoners slept, 3 tiers of wooden planks, no mattresses, no proper blankets, spaces so narrow they had to sleep on their sides, pressed together. They photographed the latrines, holes in the ground, no privacy, no hygiene, places where disease spread unchecked. They photographed the punishments. They found a special block where prisoners were tortured. There were cells so small that one could neither stand nor lie down, only crouch. There were walls with bullet marks where executions took place. There were instruments that looked as if they belonged to another century. All of it in the 20th century. All of it in a country that considered itself civilized. The photographs of the survivors were the most striking. Faces that were skin over bone, hollow eyes, bodies that seemed impossible to sustain. And yet they were there, surviving, testifying by their very existence to what had happened. One of the photographers, who had documented bloody battles, said that photographing the survivors was the hardest thing he had ever done. He felt he was invading their dignity, exhibiting their suffering. But he also understood it was necessary, because without those images many people would not believe it. So he photographed with respect. He asked permission when he could, and when survivors said no, he respected it. In March 1945, 2 months after liberation, the camp began to transform. It was no longer a functioning extermination center. It was an improvised hospital, a documentation center, an investigation site. The Soviets had brought in specialists, historians, forensic experts, criminal investigators. They wanted to understand how it had worked, not only out of interest, but because there would be trials, and trials needed solid evidence. The forensic experts examined remains in pits. They tried to estimate numbers. They tried to determine causes of death. It was difficult work. The Nazis had burned most of the bodies. What remained was fragmentary. Broken bones, ash mixed with earth, remains deliberately concealed. But even with the destruction of evidence, there was enough to reconstruct what was essential. The exact numbers might never be known with complete precision, but the order of magnitude was clear. Hundreds of thousands, possibly more than 1 million, in Auschwitz alone. And Auschwitz was one among several extermination camps. The total scale of the Holocaust was beginning to reveal itself, and it was worse than many had imagined. The historians interviewed survivors. They took detailed notes. They recorded testimonies when they could. Each story was unique, but together they formed a pattern, a system designed to destroy an entire people. Not only to kill it, but to erase its existence, eliminate culture, language, history, as if it had never existed. One of the survivors, a rabbi from Poland, said something to a Soviet historian that was recorded in archives. The Nazis didn't only want to kill us. They wanted it to be as if we had never lived. They wanted nothing to remain. Not a name, not a grave, not a memory. But they failed. Because here I am. And as long as there are survivors, there will be memory. Those words captured something essential about what had happened there. It was not only about liberating prisoners. It was about liberating the truth, ensuring that what happened could not be denied, that there would be witnesses, that there would be evidence, that there would be memory. The Soviet soldiers who had liberated the camp began to rotate to other destinations. The war continued. Berlin had not yet fallen, but those who had been in Auschwitz carried that experience with them. Some spoke of it constantly, as if they needed to process it. Others never spoke, carrying the weight in silence. But all of them were changed. A soldier wrote in his diary, "I came to this war to defend my country, to stop the fascists. I thought I knew why we were fighting, but only when I entered Auschwitz did I truly understand it. This was what was being stopped. And now I know that every day of this war, every battle, every sacrifice, had meaning, because this was stopped." In April 1945, as the war in Europe was nearing its end, Auschwitz was already known throughout the world. The reports had circulated, the photos had been published, diplomats had visited. Plans were being made to preserve the site not as a camp, but as a memorial, a reminder, a warning. But first the war had to be finished. The last Nazis had to be defeated. The last camps had to be liberated, and those responsible had to be brought to justice. The Soviets documented every crime, every name, every detail with care, because they knew that when the shooting ended, another fight would begin. The battle for historical truth. The battle to ensure that it would not be forgotten.